If you've ever wanted an art school education, but you don't want to dole out the years and thousands of dollars on it, or maybe you do have an arts education, but you really want to double down on the representational painting skills, this video is for you. I am featuring one of my favorite art books. I've made many videos about my favorite art books, and to be honest with you, this maybe is near the top because it's one of the only books that really addresses how to take on different projects so that you become measurably better at your representational painting skills. The book is called How to See Color and Paint It by Arthur Stern. It is an old book, and I'm always really hesitant to recommend it because it goes in and out of print. I'm actually unsure if it is from the 60s or 80s. The copyright in this edition says 1964, but if you Google it online, it says it's from the 80s. So if someone who has a better background in publishing knows what that discrepancy could mean, please let me know. All that to say, it is an older book, but if you've ever been around painting professors, or if you've ever chatted with an artist, maybe someone who's been around a while, then you've likely heard of this book. It's really kind of a tenet in the arts community. There have obviously been other great books, but what makes this one different is that you have about 3 chapters of setup, which I'll go into in this video, but then it's followed by 22 projects that you do at increasing levels of difficulty. And then by the end of it, you should have basically what feels like, to me anyways, about 2 semesters worth of painting 1 and painting 2, respectively, under your belt. In this video, I'm going to go over those first 3 chapters and set it up, and then I'm going to create a subsequent series where I do all of the projects. In fact, I'm filming this after I've already done the first project, so you'll get to see me paint these. And I should say that this is a part of my online art school, which is a paid platform where I teach. I have 16 and counting courses on there and a community. I'm really proud of it. I think it's a wonderful place to be, but I always have a passion for YouTube, and so I'm going to be creating an abbreviated version on here. But if you want to see me paint these in real time, if you want to be part of the community where we're painting these all together, I can't recommend signing up for Not Sari Art School enough. I will talk about it later in the video. Without further ado, let's get into the first 3 chapters. I should say I was drawn to this book because I was gifted a book when I graduated from my undergrad. I got a degree in graphic design and I got a degree in fine art, specializing in painting. And I remember someone gave me a book that called itself kind of like an MFA in book form. It took you through several projects, and I can remember loving the idea. I did not, however, love graphic design in the same way that I love painting. I respect it. I'm always awed by people who are good at it. It's not my thing, but I remember thinking, gosh, I wish there was a painting equivalent to this. And it's been a long time. This was like maybe 11 years ago, so I'm struggling to remember the exact details, and I don't know if I said something about that project or it just was one of those thrift store finds. I'm really not sure, but I stumbled upon this book, which is kind of exactly that. In the introduction to this video, I said that it kind of feels like a painting 1 and painting 2 semester all consolidated in one, and I definitely stand by that. I think that's the tagline of this, and it's tough because, like I said, I always am hesitant to recommend it because it's not always in print. But I'm bringing it up now because I will be providing a lot of the resources. I should say, in addition to filming these live and in real-time speed for my online art school, I also have accompanying blogs with every single chapter that you guys can look at as well. It has the materials list. So while I recommend getting the book if you can find it, because it's not always in print and production, I'm always careful with how I recommend it. And I think just making it a whole project, sharing resources, giving insights, and working through the projects myself would be a great way to talk about this book, which is why I thought that going ahead and sharing all the resources like the materials list, the setup. So every project revolves around a shadow box situation. So for me, it is 3 pieces of architectural foam board that I've taped to where there's a bottom and 2 corners. And then you put a light source on it, so a lamp. For me, it's an LED light. And then various objects that have very specific colors. I have a pack of construction paper that I'm using. Each project calls for something different. Again, we'll get into the project in subsequent videos, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And then every project starts simple, and then as the book works up, becomes a little more complex. Because of this, the format of the book is really not that you get these great insights by way of the reading and the text. Hopefully the insights come from you doing. That's kind of, the book really feels like giving you a setup, throwing you in feet first and learning, which I will say as an arts educator, as much as I wish I could tell you that watching so many videos and taking so many seminars is going to make you a great painter, the truth is painting will make you a great painter. And I really do believe to some degree, you don't necessarily need anything. If you're willing to sort of paint from life and paint nature, and you don't mind the feeling of flailing a bit, like that is the best way to learn to paint, and it's free. That being said, the setup in the first 3 chapters gives you the structure, the scaffolding, the framework, however you want to say it, to plug in the subsequent projects. So with that being said, what is in the first chapters? The first 3 chapters could be broken into 3 kind of big concepts. The first one is the premise of the book, the second one is material, and the third one is language. The author, Arthur K. Stern, starts the book with one of these, which he instructs you how to build in the materials section. This is a view catcher. It is a humble piece of scrap cardboard that I was otherwise going to throw away, that I've painted with a middle gray, so black and white paint, and then poked a hole into. Very simple, very accessible, and kind of the backbone of this entire book. In fact, he basically says the only thing you need, other than of course the paints and the surfaces and the palette knives, is this view catcher. And so if you take nothing else from this video, make one of these and use these. These are fantastic. He starts out the book saying he's with a group of students. They're painting en plein air, which is just the French and fancy way of saying in nature. So they're looking out at a vista, and he asks his students, what do you see? What colors are those houses and villas in the distance? And they of course look and they see terracotta tile and white facade. So they say white, and they say orange and brown and green grass and green trees. And he asks them to look again and asks them if they're really sure. And of course, you know that if you've ever been around these structures, so a tree with green leaves and brown bark, or a building that has been painted white, we know that those colors are those objects because when we go and get up an inch away from them in daylight, we know the color. But the premise of the book argues that we don't really paint what we see as new painters, we just paint what we know. So instead of actually looking at what we're seeing and isolating the color with something like a view catcher, you really adhere to what you know. And if you can break yourself of this habit and really get yourself to just look at the color, then you'll be a better painter. So to continue with the story, he has the students hold up their view catchers, and when isolated, the terracotta roof was not in fact orangey brown, but a warmer shade of blue, maybe a true gray, and the white facade of the building was actually very light blue, and the leaves in the tree were not in fact green, but greenish blue. And the reason for this is when something is in the distance, there's a lot of atmospheric perspective, water particles basically trapped between your eye and the object that significantly augments the way we look at things. And it's not just water vapor that augments color, right? It's also color next to other color can influence. It's lighting, it's temperature, it's fog, it's atmosphere. There's an endless amount of things that can change something from what we know. If we hold an orange in front of us and hold it in our hands, we can say this is orange. But an orange in a tree in the distance might actually be cast in shadow with water vapor between us and might actually be closer to a brown. And by training your eye to really be objective with what you're looking at, instead of painting what you know, but paint what you see, you unlock painting. And it is the difference between someone who makes paintings that kind of look like cartoons and illustrations into all of a sudden you have a masterful understanding of color that no matter how realistic or abstract you paint is going to always be useful. Then, of course, later in the chapter, he lays out the premise of the book. I already did this, 3 chapters of framework and insight, followed by 22 projects, and a chapter or 2 at the end that summarizes it. Which brings us to our next chapter, materials. Again, I have an accompanying blog if it's helpful to see these. If you're trying to take notes as you watch this, I definitely direct you there. I think it's easier to just see it in writing. He lays out 7 colors plus white. He also asks you to use a palette knife instead of a brush. I'll get into the reasoning in just a moment, as well as mediums, surfaces, materials. This is a part of the book that I think is the most dated, not in a significant way by any means, but for example, I feel like whenever this book was published, so again, 60s or 80s, but a significant time ago. They didn't have quite the options that we do now. So he has you paint on canvas pad and cut it in half. I presume that this is because there wasn't a plethora of different sizes of canvas pad. I also am presuming here, but there wasn't options like Arches oil paper, which is a great paper surface that you can paint oil on. And with the exact pigments, I presume that there was a more narrow range of these colors. So for example, phthalo blue now comes in a multitude of hues, from blue shade to green shade to red shade, and it can really depend from brand to brand. I should say one note that I am changing with this book, because I'm trying not to just like retell the book entirely, but go through the lens of me, a teacher, an artist. I've painted for 15 years. I've taught for closer to 8. I have an online art school. I'm trying to use my lens to not only update it, but also to make it more simple and fit YouTube. So there is a little bit of augmentation here, also to respect the copyright. Definitely, if you can find the book, find the book. But I, of course, am doing this with acrylic paint and mediums and slightly adjusting it. Again, the blog talks a little more about this reasoning. If you're following along, please know that you can use any medium that is opaque and layerable. That is to say, opaque-ish, so something like a gouache as opposed to watercolor, which is translucent and would need a different set of instructions and projects for it to fully work. Obviously, if you don't mind kind of forging your own path, you can use any medium you want with this, right? But as an instructor and in respect to my home studio, which does not have great ventilation, I will be using acrylic. I think it's the best medium for learning for a multitude of reasons. I'll save that for a separate video. That being said, I am using Golden and Liquitex acrylic paints. I'm also using heavy body because when you paint with a palette knife, you tend to need a little bit thicker viscosity. It's not a deal breaker, and it might be more personal to me than a general rule, but I find that when you are using sort of a medium or heavy body, you can layer a little bit better, where it can kind of feel like you're trying to pick up soup if you're using something like a soft body, or certainly something more liquidy like an ink. As far as medium, I am just using a little bit of Flow Aid. This is one of my favorite mediums from Liquitex. I use it in lieu of a water. So if you paint with acrylic, you normally paint with water, but you find that it breaks down and kind of gets weird and dusty when it dries, try switching out with a Flow Aid medium. This is very liquidy like water, and I just use a drop or two just to get it to extend. They also have a slow dry version, so if you really struggle with how fast acrylics tend to dry and you want to try acrylics, that might be a good option. Also, I would suggest on that note, if drying too quickly is your problem and you're not ready to switch over to oils, you could also try using the Golden Open Series Titanium White. I say that as opposed to having to replace every single color with the Open Series version, because typically when you're painting, you mix white in with most colors most of the time, and just subbing in white will make all of your paints dry slower. And that way, it's kind of a hack if you want to try the Open Series, but you don't want to dole out, $150 for all new paints. But those are tips. Feel free to, again, use whatever medium you would like. Arthur Stern also talks about your surfaces. So in this case, your mixing surfaces, he recommends using something like a palette paper. I really am partial to the gray palette paper because it helps you to better see your values. By any means, use whatever you need. Anything from paper plates would work, all the way up to glass palettes. That's what I use in my working studio. But he suggests using gray surface, gray glass, and I would recommend using palette paper. And then, of course, the surface you're painting on, of course, this is also very customizable. If you're using a journal that can hold up to water-based mediums like acrylic, obviously you can do that. I am just using paper that is made for acrylic. So the Canson one is great. Winsor & Newton also has a great option. I'm super not picky about my paper. But one thing I should add that I'm doing a little differently from Arthur Stern is, in the spirit of having that neutral gray to help you make better value choices, which I think is particularly helpful in this book. I'll get to that in Mindset in just a moment. I am using gray gesso. This is N5, which is middle gray, so right halfway between black and white. I use this a lot in my personal practice as well. I think it's great. In college, we were instructed to prime all of our surfaces with middle gray to help us make better value choices. And given that our first statement is a very important part of his methodology, he doesn't say this, but I do think starting with middle gray as a primed surface is very helpful. And if it's all the same to you, you can get this Liquitex version, or you can simply mix your white gesso or titanium white paint with a little bit of black until it is visually right in the middle, not 50-50 as in like your recipe, but visually halfway between black and white, and prep your surfaces. It really does help with that initial statement. Arthur Stern goes over at the very end of the chapter the last couple things that you may want to include, such as, do you need an easel or just a surface to paint on? And while he doesn't dedicate a tremendous amount of airtime to this cause, I appreciate how he really does make it accessible. Like, you don't have to have a full functioning fancy studio, although if you're painting in oils, of course, you should always make sure you have proper ventilation for health purposes, and make sure that you're wearing gloves if you're handling things like cadmiums and cobalts. He does call for cadmium, so if you're using actual cadmium, be careful to not get it on your skin. Of course, safety first. But he really says just make sure you have a setup that works for you, that there's good lighting and that you're comfortable and that you have a place to mix your paint and a surface to paint on and that you have your view catcher and adequate colors. But the last thing I wanted to dedicate a little bit of time to as far as the materials is the palette knife. Now, of course, you can do this with a brush if you would like. You can also do it with your fingers, but I think as a teacher, as an instructor, as someone who paints in this style, this is kind of a direct painting method as opposed to indirect, I really value the palette knife. It wasn't my material of choice. I don't even know in college if we used one very often, so I am very accustomed to mixing my paints, all of my mixes, with a brush. And so I can remember doing this project and being kind of put off by the palette knife. I have since grown to love the palette knife. I do a lot of my paintings with it, and so things have changed. But don't feel intimidated. Yes, the palette knife, even with some practice, will feel very rudimentary, kind of clunky, not as swift as a plethora of brushes, especially the lovely little tiny brushes that allow you to get detail. But it actually ties into sort of the ethos, the fiber of the book, which is to say, prioritizing accurate color and value assessments. Again, training your brain to properly see color and then mix big color statements and relying on that process as opposed to gesturing and mark making and picture making to make a painting look good. Again, if you can kind of train yourself out of that, which this book really does, the world is your oyster when it comes to representational painting. I digress. And so you're going to be doing a lot of color mixing. So spending more time, I don't know if it's part of your process already, if not, to each their own. But the instruction of the book really prioritizes looking at something, isolating it with a view catcher, that is to say all the gray around the little hole allows you to see the color for what it is without context, because as we all know, the context of what's around the color you're mixing, let's say you're trying to mix the oranges in the tree, is going to be affected by everything else around it. Color is contextual, so everything's going to be affected by everything that's around it. So isolating the color, mixing it with your palette knife, and then yes, even applying it with your palette knife. I would say that if you're kind of on the fence, you don't really want to use the palette knife, but it's all the same to you, try using the palette knife. Arthur K. Stern recommends using two of them, one that's more of a knife shape and one that's more of a trowel shape, that this little divot is called a trowel. He wants you to mix with this one and apply with this one. If it's all the same to you, you can get away with one of these. He recommends painting on a 9x12 surface. Again, I really would like to keep that to where work on whatever works for you. If you like to paint small, paint on 8x10. If you like to paint bigger, paint on 16x20, whatever it is, do what works for you. But I will say, when you're picking your size, make sure that your trowel head is a good size relative to the surface you'll be painting on. If you're painting really big, get a bigger palette knife. If you're painting a little smaller, get a smaller palette knife. But just understand that even though the tapered tip of the trowel shape allows you to get quite a bit of detail, you won't be able to get a ton of detail, and that's actually good. There's this tendency when newer painters or painters who haven't had some training, some formal lessons, workshops, art school, etc., to really cling on to mark making and gestures and fussiness as opposed to seeing the bigger picture. A good example of this would be if you're painting someone's hair, you might really lock in on the individual strands or the highlights or the chunks as opposed to looking at your hair as an entire mass. And painting with a big brush or a palette knife forces you to see the bigger picture because you cannot paint it, not cannot. Artists are capable of everything. It is really, really difficult to try to paint strands of hair with a big palette knife. And so it forces you to make bigger statements, which does in fact end up helping you train your eye. That's kind of the reasoning behind the palette knife. And finally, in the last chapter, Arthur Stern goes over how to see and understand color, as well as the process of making a first, second, and third statement. When it comes to the color, he provides you a black and white color wheel where he asks you to find and understand 12 different hues on your color wheel. Hues are basically the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, but I think why that's important to have in an instructional book is because understanding how to describe color is kind of another aspect that trains your brain how to think differently, think more like a painter. There's this real tendency with artists to want to have a bigger vocabulary to describe more colors, so chartreuse and vermilion and khaki and olive. That's certainly fine, that's a neutral attribute, but it's more important that you begin to understand color words in terms of, is this warm, is this cool, is this muted, is this medium intensity, is this really, really chromatic? That is basically what I always call color coordinates. I don't believe Arthur Stern uses that phrasing, but if you can train your brain to think this way, it helps you to see more colors. There's this idea in color theory that is a part of what's called linguistic relativity, which means that the more color vocab you have, you actually can physically see more colors. There's a great study with the Himbi tribe that kind of hints at this. We also know this from people who speak multiple languages and have reported seeing color differently. You're retraining your brain how to say the color words differently, which opens up the amount of color vocab you have. It's not like pretty words like Sierra, Rose, Misty, Mountain, things like that. That is very cool. I very much consider that an aspect of writing skills and not art or color skills, but we're gonna learn color coordinates. I've made this color chart. It accompanies the book wonderfully. I basically use his color wheel that he's divided into 12, and then I've subdivided it to see the neutrals and to understand the color complements, which is another part of that color coordinates that we will use. I also have a section for all of the 12 hues, which are of course all the colors on the outside of the color wheel plus titanium white. He dedicates a couple of paragraphs to understanding how each color changes kind of significantly with the addition of white, as well as the color gradations, which I think is the most helpful part of this color wheel. I think it's a really helpful part of my own personal teaching methodology to have students make a color wheel and then to tape it next to them when they're painting. It's easy to think, oh, I understand what is the opposite of red. I have it memorized. I learned it in first grade. But when you're in the weeds of color mixing, being able to know what is exactly the opposite of red, orange, more specifically, is wildly helpful. And you can also see here all of the different neutrals you can get from mixing color complements, so the opposite color on the color wheel. And this is kind of a cheat sheet. Color mixing is hard. Some people have it a little bit innately, but almost everyone has to kind of work for it. And having this there as you're developing that muscle and that skill set is not only helpful, but I think it helps you build a better, more solid foundation, so you don't feel like you're flailing with color, but that you're really understanding the basics so you can build upon that as you develop as an artist. I should also say that in the blog, which I will accompany down below, I have included a free PDF of that. If you would like to print it out on cardstock and mix it yourself, I do recommend it. I should also say that a version of me mixing this entire color chart exists on my online art school. If you would like to sign up to be a lifetime member, you can get access to that, where I talk through all the specifics of color mixing this chart. Okay, we're down to our final 2 points that Arthur Stern lays out in his first chapters before we jump into the projects. And the next one is kind of a continuation on developing color language, and that is to not use the forbidden names, or he calls it the dirty words. It's neither here nor there, but it's the idea that you don't rely on using words like gray, brown, white, or black too often. And I know that kind of sounds crazy, because if you've ever painted from life or in nature, there is a tremendous amount of gray, brown, black, and white in nature. But the idea is, again, it's kind of training your brain to see the hues all the way down. I wish I had a version of this that was humongous, because when you have a color wheel, you have, of course, the outside, which is the most chromatic or intense. That's just how brightly saturated a color is. You also have value, which is how light or how dark. But when it comes to naming colors, everyone, even a first grader, could point to all these outside edges and easily name what the color is, right? Yellow, green, green, blue, red, right? All that stuff. Easy peasy. But as you go towards the center of the color wheel, and theoretically, right in the middle, you would have what's called achromatic gray. So without color gray, a gray that is so neutral that it doesn't skew blue or purple or any other color. It is unto itself, it is a pure mixture of black and white, would be right in the middle. And as you get closer to the center, it becomes more difficult to exactly name the color. And what he's asking you to do is resist the urge to call any color that's kind of muddy gray, but rather prioritize its hue name. So even though here, this purple sort of turns into gray and kind of falls off a cliff, and it would be understandable if someone pointed to this color and said, oh, it's kind of gray. If you can resist that urge and call it purple for as long as possible, it helps you in your color mixing. One of the things I have my students do all the time is pretend that they're picking up a phone and describing a color to a friend. It sort of forces you to sort of pick a word. So tan, beige, but those again are very neutral words. So what I ask you to do if you were looking at a beige is go, if you were under duress, someone was gonna take all your paints and throw them in the trash, right? Something scary. And they said, you have to tell me what hue this is, or I'm gonna throw all your paints away. You would have to say red or purple. Don't stress if it's not completely, perfectly, accurately correct. If someone came up to whatever color you were trying to name with a device, and I'm sure they exist, but that could exactly tell you what the hex code, what the Pantone color of the object was in front of you, even if there was a true objective way to exactly name the exact color and what hue it was close to, it's okay if you're a little bit wrong. Having the language of a starting point of, I don't know what color that is, I guess if I had to pick, it's closer to purple. That is actually a massive achievement and a massive step forward, as uncomfortable as that can feel in the beginning. And I know from teaching in person, it is uncomfortable in the beginning, but you're going to start by having purple. So whether you mixed it on your palette or you're mixing blue and red and starting with purple, you're going to get a color purple. It's going to be way too chromatic because remember the color was like almost gray. But by mixing in the complement and scooting it around and getting it closer, you have at least a jumping in point, which I find tends to be a big hang up point for students. They either are too scared to kind of pick the color, or they default and somehow see everything as like green or purple or red, which it happens. But again, we're developing that language, which is going to help us to be able to see color better and then mix color better. And finally, Arthur Stern introduces 3 statements that I believe are very helpful to setting up paintings. And those are, of course, the first statement, second statement, and third statement. I really like this. One analogy that I like to use when I'm teaching students how to go from big general to specific is think about using a microscope. I feel like in 6th grade, at least where I'm from, like we all learned how to use a microscope all in one day. And you start out by learning how to take the little thing you're looking at and just simply find it, right? You move around the little disc until you see it within the sight line of your microscope. And then you do a middle level of tuning. It's kind of in the middle, you rotate it until what you're looking at begins to come in and out of focus. And then finally you have the fine tuning where you found it, you've kind of got it to where it kind of looks like a thing, and then the fine tuning allows it to be crystal clear, right? And I think the mistake that students make a lot is the whole reason that they picked something was likely because of the detail, the shine on an apple, the glow of a sunset, and sometimes what really makes a painting pop, in fact, oftentimes, unfortunately, what makes a painting pop isn't really painted or brought to life until the last 10% of your painting. So you're spending the first 90%, kind of with something that's like swampy and ugly and not that pretty, but you have to do it in the correct order. There's not too much when it comes to representational painting that I really adhere to as like, you have to do it. I think there's, so many ways to peel a carrot, and there's so many ways to do anything, especially under the umbrella of painting. But I would say one of the very few things that I think should be followed, generally speaking, for most painters, is working from general to specific. That's the language I use. Arthur uses first statement, and first statement, despite the fact that it is part of 3 statements, is kind of most of your painting. In fact, he references the old adage, well begun is half done. And the idea is that when you make big, as accurate as possible color statements and value statements initially, then the rest of the painting is just kind of fine tuning, right? Another analogy I would use is if you're building a house, you don't want to hang curtains before you've done drywall. So by keeping things in order, you really make it easier for yourself and better for yourself. So luckily with a palette knife, you can't get a lot of detail anyways, or it's a little more difficult to. And so he asks you to sort of break up what you're seeing into simple forms. In fact, in the first project, you're only mixing 9 sections of paint. You're breaking up an object into 9, you're looking at something in real life. There's infinite colors and values and shapes and forms in it, but he's saying simply break it up into 9 pieces, mix 9 puddles of paint, and then apply that, generally speaking. Arthur Stern does allow you to use a pencil, so in the process it would be priming it gray and then spending some time measuring it out. Depending on who you are, what your background is, everyone draws different. Again, this is one of those areas where I don't tend to be too dogmatic. If you want to use a projector, if you want to use a grid, if you want to freehand it and don't mind it being wonky, this isn't really a book about drawing. We're really focusing on color and value. So whatever is easiest for you. I, of course, like to freehand and use plumb lines, and that's what I talk through in the class. That's over on Not Sorry Art School. But you just want to get in the simple shape. So the top of the object, the side where the light hits, and get it broken up into big value chunks. So the last kind of tip I'll say within this is if there's a light source on, let's say, the black back of the box, even though it's one solid object, you will want to delineate with your pencil where the light is concentrated and then where it's middle and then darkest, right? That might be, even though it's one object, 3 forms, because the light has visual weight. It takes up a lot of space, right? If you've ever painted something that has really harsh, contrasty shadows, you know that the shadows visually take up as much space. They're as bold and they pop out to you as much as the actual objects you're painting. And so Arthur Stern asks you to delineate those with your statements. The second statement is, of course, breaking down the forms even more. So if we started out our initial painting with 9 forms, now we might try to see 20 different objects. So the side of the toilet paper roll, which we made all one color in the first statement, we might try to go in and find 2 or 3, right? And then the final statement kind of depends on how much you're trying to refine your painting to, because you could kind of do this indefinitely, is just finding even more of those subtle moments, right? Where is there reflected light? Where is there maybe a coarse shadow? How can we use breaking up the form to create texture? As I work through this, I will flush through those last couple statements a little bit more in detail, but for the sake of time and covering all our bases, I will leave it right there. Hopefully this was helpful. I really like hearing other people's sort of methodology and idea behind painting, because again, there's so many ways to learn how to paint. There's so many ways to execute a painting. There's certainly so many ways to teach it. And there's rarely like truly a wrong way. So I always feel like I learn a little bit when anyone teaches or shows how they're going to teach something. The first time I read this book, I was purely a student. I had graduated, I had gone to school for art, but I still found this to be a really good practice to sort of shore up my own fundamentals. And then of course, recently when I'm preparing to work through this book with an audience and my online art school, I thought of it completely different and I found it delightful in both times. I hope you're able to join me or at least follow along and gain some insights. If you do, make sure to tag me, Not Sorry Art School, and then in the caption, say which project you're working on or let me know. I would love to see it. Even if you're not part of the online art school, I still think this could be a fun community engagement moment. And speaking of my online art school, again, I will be doing all of these every other Monday on a live where you can ask questions and I can talk through the process and of course paint them in real time. I know for a lot of students, seeing someone paint it not sped up times 5 or 10 is really, really beneficial. And so I have all the videos saved there. And again, there's a community component so you can see other people working through questions. I've been answering a lot of questions about setting up the light box. So if you want a more hands-on approach, I would recommend that. My lifetime membership, which is the best thing that I offer by far, is a one-time payment and then you become part of the community for life, no recurring payments. That was very important to me because I wanted people to have community but not feel like they were having to keep up with payments, and I just didn't want that stress. So come join us. And then also, if you like the way I teach and understand and explain things, I have everything from foundations to color theory to master studies, how to paint water, how to paint portrait. It's mostly taught in acrylics, but it does work well for oils as well, and I have some lessons based in oils. And as a special gift, if you've made it this far, you can have 20% off lifetime membership to Not Sorry Art School using code CColor26 in order to get that for the duration as long as I do this on YouTube. I'd love to have you as a member and see you in the lives. Otherwise, thank you for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe so you can follow along as I work through all 22 projects in the book. As always, happy painting, and I'll see you in the next video.